Welcome to this special edition of كلمة as part of Mayadeen's in-depth coverage and debates about the war in Ukraine. Tonight we are asking the biggest question of all. Are we heading towards nuclear war? Well, the short answer is not yet. But if one looks at that question from the point of view of the famous doomsday clock, then we're definitely a few seconds from midnight. We've never been closer to nuclear war than we currently are as you watch this program. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which as a child I still recall, chilled my blood. I went to bed thinking I might be in a nuclear war by the morning, and I was only 6 years old. But since then, and that was resolved, of course, by diplomacy between President John Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the then leader of the Soviet Union. Since then, there has been a mutually assured destruction balance in the world, and supporters of nuclear weapons have always argued that presence of nuclear balance kept the peace, by and large, in terms of large-scale wars until at least the end of the Soviet era. Then there was a brief unipolar period in the world where, although China and Russia possessed nuclear weapons, they were not possessed of the economic and political strength in themselves and in the world in order to be a credible user of them. And in that unipolar period, the United States ran riot, particularly in Iraq, but also elsewhere. Now that we have a China and Russia resurgent, in the first case economically, in the second case with a wholly modernized armed forces and particularly nuclear armed forces, we obviously have a genuine balance of terror. And therefore, when it began to be a real question as to whether NATO would apply a no-fly zone in Ukraine, the whole question of nuclear war suddenly loomed large on the political agenda. Of course, when they say no-fly zone, they mean plenty fly zone. They had a no-fly zone over Libya, but there was plenty of flying. It was NATO planes intervening in the civil conflict in Libya to what has turned out to be disastrous results. Results I predicted to them at the time. But a no-fly zone over Ukraine would, of course, be a wholly different matter, because it would mean that Russian airplanes would be shot down by either NATO pilots or NATO anti-air defensive batteries. And, of course, the hostilities between both sides would then become general. If they became general and one side or the other began to lose ground, if the Russian side began to advance into the Baltics towards Poland, or equally if the NATO side began to advance towards the Russian frontier, then battlefield nuclear weapons would, without question, be deployed. And if battlefield nuclear weapons were deployed, then it wouldn't be long before intermediate range, and then even, in the worst case scenario, intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, which would of course bring about the end of the world. It sounds like apocalypse now. But when I see the recklessness of the Western politicians, but particularly the Western media, including media paid for by the Western governments, by subterfuge usually, I wonder just how close we got, how close we are. As always, I'm just the enthusiastic amateur here. I'm joined by a panel of distinguished experts. And let me turn now to the first of those. Professor Andrew MacLeod is Australian-British. He's a visiting professor at King's College London, which, how shall I put it, is quite close as a institution to the military-industrial intelligence complex in Britain, but his research subject areas are conflict and security, human rights forensics, but he's also a writer, a speaker, a humanitarian, and a traveller. I hope you got plenty of travel in, Professor, because there might not be so much travel in the months and years to come. Give me your take. Are we heading towards a nuclear war?
We are closer to nuclear war than the world has ever been. We are significantly closer to nuclear war than the Cuban Missile Crisis to which you referred. The Cuban Missile Crisis would have required Khrushchev and Kennedy to lose complete faith in the discussions between each other. Here, we are as close to nuclear war as Putin wants us to be. Yes, he could deploy tactical weapons, as could Western governments. If Putin decides to put a foot into a NATO country, over the border into Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, we're in all sorts of trouble. What happens if he actually does get into Kiev and then goes through Transnistria to Moldova? Well, Moldova's not a NATO country, so it wouldn't trigger Article 5. I think we're very, very close. I think exactly the introduction that you've put, if a no-fly zone was created and you had NATO pilots shooting at Russian pilots and vice versa, the path from that to nuclear conflict is clear, frightening, and present. And at some point, I'm looking at the airline routes and wondering, when do I jump on a plane and go back to Australia? Having just escaped the prison island for COVID to come back here, we are in the most scary time in not only my lifetime, but yours too, George.
Yes, I think that's a perfect summary. People my age, you're a bit younger than me, but even people your age, lived through the 1980s when nuclear weapons were being placed on European soil and when Soviet fears were of an offensive being launched by the West, and the whole question of cruise and Pershing missiles was on everyone's lips, if not on their lips, at least in the back of their mind. And it was on the lips of millions of people on the streets in demonstrations and so on. This time it isn't. Why?
So it's a lot more confusing. There's a general rule in international affairs, which is this: if the answer seems simple, then it's not the answer. It's always a lot more complex than it first appears. If you go back just to 2014, which in the context of this current dispute is very recent history, did the West mishandle what could have been done in Crimea, for example? If instead of saying to the Russians, you can't have Crimea, if the West had have said, you can't take Crimea by force, but is there a way we could have had, for an example, an
leaseback, for example,
or an OSCE-monitored referendum? With an OSCE-monitored referendum in Kosovo as well. Russia doesn't support Kosovo's independence. Russia claims that all of Serbia needed to vote, whereas the West says all of Ukraine needed to vote on Crimea. Yet we only had Scotland voting in their referendum more or less at the same time. Unfortunately, I don't know if you agree with me, I wish Scotland had have become independent.
Not me, no. I don't like countries breaking.
Right. So if we had have back in 2014 said, OK, let's have an OSCE-monitored referendum, no one disputes the vast majority of the people in Crimea would have preferred to have been in Russia, as they were before Khrushchev signed the document to give them to Ukraine. No one disputes that Kosovo would want its independence. If we had two monitored referenda, Crimea would have joined Russia, Russia won one, Kosovo would have got its independence, Russia lost one, we win one, you win one. Let's now move on to the much more important issue, as it was at the time. How do Russia and the West work together to counter a rise in China, as opposed to pushing Russia into China's hands? So you've now got President Xi and President Putin working very closely together through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and other institutions. Now, I can lay all of this out and I can give you pros and cons to both. There is no very clear answer. But I think we mishandled 2014. I think we have underestimated the Rostov-on-Don line, which is a line basically from St. Petersburg to Rostov-on-Don. Whenever Russia is pushed that far east by Napoleon, by Hitler, now by us, Russia pushes back. Whenever Russia gets to Germany, the West pushes back. And we've seen this over centuries. And what's really playing out here is the dominance into Ukraine so upset the Russians had to respond, but that's not a justification to violently invade another country and target civilians and hospitals. So you've got right and wrong on both sides on this one. So we are in a very precarious situation because people are cherry-picking the parts of history that make their case, and we are in a very, very dangerous time.
It sounds like a considerable failure in statecraft. It would have been better if you were at the top table, I think. Shiraz Paracha, an old friend of mine, the last time we met was in Kazakhstan, and you're going back there. I'm glad to say you're a commentator, analyst on Central Asia, Russia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. Professor MacLeod has, I think, splendidly, vividly demonstrated how we got here.
Yeah.
How does it look, do you think, from the Russian side? Because that's absent by deliberate policy from Western media.
When you look at things from Russian point of view, Russian says that, look, you deceived us in 1990s when you promised that NATO will not expand an inch westwards, but then there were 5 waves of NATO expansions since then. Then they also, recently, I don't want to go into the history, but in December 2021, President Vladimir Putin asked the NATO and Americans for legal security guarantees. But they just put that aside. They did not take it seriously. And from Russian point of view, they say that for 8 years, what was going on in Donbas region, and ethnic Russians were, the way they were cleansed, the way they were targeted, the way they were discriminated. 14,000 people killed since 2014. So Russian says that Putin says that, but suppose if we go to Canada or Mexico, how would you feel about it if we install missiles there? And then, as you rightly said, in what happened in 1962, there was a hysteria in the United States. At that time, there was no such media and social media. Otherwise, things would have been different. So even if a foreign country comes, for example, in Ireland, how the Brits will behave, what Britain did in Falklands.
Or in Scotland. If Professor MacLeod had won the referendum instead of me, you might have a Scottish government making an alliance with Russia or China.
Yeah.
It's not hard to see what Britain would do. A man who knows what Britain does in the north of Ireland is Fra Hughes, who's in Belfast. Fra, as an independent journalist, has worked in the Donbass and has written a book about it. Fra, welcome to the show.
Hi, George, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to appear on this show.
You have been in the Donbass, not once, but twice. You've written a book about it. You highlight the existence amongst the Ukrainian forces along the line of contact who are, let's call them far right. Some of them are avowedly Nazi, but others are definitely describable as far right. To what extent do you think that has been a factor in the last 8 years?
Yes, I've been in both of the republics. The first thing I maybe want to stress on behalf of the people who live there is that they told me on numerous occasions that they were Russian speakers, but they were Ukrainian. They didn't see themselves as Russians living in Ukraine. They saw themselves as Ukrainians who spoke Russian as their first language. And they felt very strongly that they didn't leave Ukraine, that Ukraine left them. And to put that in the context then of the far right, of the Azov Brigade and of the right sector and of President Zelensky and the people that he has surrounded himself with, I don't think it takes a great number of people who have violent intent in their hearts in order to have a huge effect both on politics and on the body politic of society itself. And because these people have never been faced down, and in fact, in some instances have been encouraged, they were used as the frontline foot soldiers in Mayadeen in 2014 for the coup. And then they continued after 2014 when Lugansk and Donetsk became separate, independent, autonomous regions or republics to fire on the contact line, and for 8 years continued a war of aggression against the people in the Donbass region.
Were you surprised by the vehemence and the unanimity, more or less, of the Western response to the Russian intervention in Ukraine?
Well, I think that Putin and Russia, by extension, perhaps didn't have much choice in actually invading or having their special military operations in Ukraine. There were 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers, many of whom or some of whom were fascist, on the border and the contact line. They looked like they were going to invade the two autonomous regions. So Russia would then either have fascists once they reoccupied those particular regions, fascists on the border with Russia, the possible massacre of the people who were Russian-speaking and anti-fascist and anti-Nazi. So I don't think Putin necessarily had much of a choice as to whether or not to invade. But I think this suits NATO and the Western agenda and Joe Biden. And I think there was a whole propaganda industry already set in place that as soon as one rocket, one shell, one bullet, or one boot from Russia came across that border onto Ukrainian soil, that this whole propaganda machine was already in place. And it was a matter of flicking a switch and bringing on the BBC and Sky News, CNN are very good to have a list of people that they go to first in order to promote the war propaganda that we are witnessing in Western Europe. And in Britain, there is a deluge, 24/7, one-sided warmongering propaganda. And with the banning of Russia Today and many alternative media sites, it is nearly impossible to get a view on what is happening both on the ground and politically in the region that hasn't been censored by Britain, NATO, the EU, and America.
You were born and have grown up in Northern Ireland. Do you see any similarities between British rule in Northern Ireland and what's happening in Ukraine?
There's always going to be like an imperialist colonial playbook. Part of that will be to demonize one side, make this a black and white conflict. So when Republicans were involved in what they saw as a national war of liberation in the north of Ireland, that was seen by the British to be terrorism. When we look at Syria, I'm sure that we had SAS people on the ground. We had SAS people on the ground in Northern Ireland during the conflict. That's something that the British government for many years denied was actually happening. So I've no doubt that in the Ukraine, you will have special undercover soldiers working hand in hand with NATO and other specialist operation units. I read an article today. If this report is true, the British government is sending service personnel with military experience to the front lines in the Ukraine with the blessing of the British government in order to be involved in a proxy undeclared war against Russia via Ukraine. And the Ukrainians are the people who will suffer.
You've been critical of Putin. In a recent article, you described this as a bear trap and said that Putin should have been able to foresee that. Explain that, please.
Exactly. I think part of the problem here is that perhaps 8 years ago, Putin and the Russian government should have accepted a plebiscite from the people in Lugansk and Donetsk to join the Russian Federation, and perhaps we wouldn't even be having this conversation today. Now, Putin may very well have invaded Ukraine at this minute in time, but the last 8 years, he has spent encouraging the regime in Kiev, which came into power from a fascist coup backed by America and Victoria Nuland. And if we remember, Joe Biden was the vice president in 2014. It is only when he returned to power in 2021 that this whole conflict has re-exploded on the scene, because he has rearmed, financed, and encouraged the regime in Kiev to saber rattle against Russia, asking for NATO membership and demanding to become a nuclear power.
Dr. Deepa Driver, academic, very important trade unionist. I know you best from your ceaseless endeavours to free Julian Assange. As I was listening to Fra there, I was thinking how much we miss Julian Assange at a time like this.
Indeed, and Julian is in very bad health at Belmarsh. It is disgusting to watch the slow murder of another human being. What WikiLeaks did was very important. And one of the things it did was to prevent the kinds of problems we see today, which is each side calling the other side propaganda, and each side deciding what is the truth. He allowed us to see the actual evidence, and then also, it allows from a historic point of view for us to create an archive of evidence which allows us to know what really happened, whether we know today, as a result of WikiLeaks cables, almost a decade ago now, that there was a promise from NATO to Russia that they would not...
not 1 inch, they said.
Not 1 inch. That I was trying to remember the phrasing, thank you. And this kind of truth, uncensored by the likes of the respectable journalists who, if you look at the media today, the coverage, Alan McLeod on Mint Press has done this fantastic analysis where they've looked at about 1,800 articles over 2 weeks, explaining how the mainstream media has covered the war. And not just covered the war in Ukraine, but also the bombing of Yemen by Saudis and attacks into Syria by Israel. And comparing this analysis, you see that over 95% of the information has been about Ukraine. The front pages have been about white people with blue eyes and blonde hair. And there has been little attention paid to the war in Yemen, where people for years now have been suffering extreme devastation, whether it is the destruction of hospitals, which is outside the rules of war, whether it is the destruction of civil infrastructure, whether it is the killing of civilians, with not just the kind of what we would say collateral damage, but the actual intentional bombing of areas where there is a serious civilian population. And this has been done with absolutely zero scrutiny, or close to zero scrutiny, amongst the Western media, who suddenly all don their yellow and blue to pretend as though they care about the people of Ukraine, who suddenly advocate for a new no-fly zone without recognizing what my colleagues have said earlier, which is the dangers that a no-fly zone provides. It isn't a dome like you have in the south of London. It's actually bringing aircraft down, putting Russia and NATO countries on a path to nuclear destruction. And this is being advocated not by the right wing, but by liberal lefties who are supposedly anti-war. So this completely changes the debate, because the left, the supposed left, is arguing for war rather than arguing for peace. So, yes, of course we need...
George Orwell, you should be alive at this hour. Left is right, war is peace, truth is lies, the world turned upside down. Well, speaking as a white, blue-eyed, formerly blonde-haired man, let me say we'll be right back after the break. You're watching a special edition of كلمة as part of Mayadeen's in-depth coverage and debates on the war in Ukraine. Professor MacLeod, something you said earlier chimed very much with me. I have been arguing this probably for the last 2 years, maybe more, on American television, that the policy that you're following of pushing Russia ineluctably and finally into the arms of China is peculiarly bad statesmanship.
Yeah.
First of all, because you will never defeat a unity of China and Russia. And secondly, because it was entirely unnecessary. Even Putin, never mind Yeltsin, asked for Russia to be able to join NATO. And then we would have had a thoroughly European security architecture, which wouldn't have required a frankly unstable American president like the last one, or a frankly not much compos mentis in the one that we have now. That would have been a far better approach, wouldn't it?
Oh, undoubtedly. And President Xi is sitting back licking his lips right now, just watching European cultures, Russia and the West, coming at each other, knowing they will weaken each other like King Harold Hardrada of Norway weakened King Harold of England to the point that William the Conqueror could just walk in. And there's no doubt that what President Xi is looking at is, what's my timeline for full reintegration of Taiwan back into the mainland of China, and what will the West's response to that be? And there's no doubt in my mind President Xi is looking at the Ukraine crisis through that lens, and he's sitting back and he's saying, Vladimir, my friend, thank you for weakening my enemy. We did not understand in the West that what needed to happen was a collaboration with Russia, and we need to go back to an expression that I really like, which is you listen to understand, you don't listen to argue. And you've got to be big enough to be able to sit with someone and say, there are things that you say and do that I don't agree with, but there's enough that we can agree with that we work together. Now, I come out of the left of Australian politics, and some of my best friends come from the alt-right of British politics. We don't agree on things, but we listen respectfully to understand the other person's view, because only when you understand the other person's view can you counter it. If you just yell at it, you'll never win. You never get people to change their mind by abuse, hectoring and yelling. You only get people to amend their views through collaboration and understanding and a mutual changing of opinion. So we missed, I think, in the West, the great opportunity to partner up with Russia. By pushing Russia into Chinese hands, we've weakened ourselves, and by having this conflict in Ukraine, what China has been able to engineer is to observe how the West is working, and I think China would have been very surprised at how quickly NATO came together, how quickly the EU came together, and how unified, rightly or wrongly, the West seems to be in responding to Russia, because that's a foreplay to how the West will respond when China inevitably goes into Taiwan.
Shiraz, the Chinese economy will definitely become the biggest in the world by the end of this decade. My own prediction is far sooner than that. In fact, these sanctions, the economic warfare that has now been unleashed, may actually very well be the midwife for a premature birth of Chinese economic hegemony. How does that look from a place like Kazakhstan, for example, which has an extensive border with both Russia and China?
I think the main beneficiary in this situation is going to be China, because Russia is going to, because Russia is now in conflict with the West, it will depend more and more on China for economic reason and also for strategic reasons. Central Asia is in an area, a region where Chinese and Russian interests, they don't match very much. And Russia considers Central Asia its backyard, its sphere of influence, while Chinese have huge investments in Kazakhstan and in Turkmenistan. And the West was hoping until recently, especially the Americans, to fan those differences between the Russians and Chinese, especially in Central Asia. What we saw in Afghanistan, you see, Tajikistan is a battle neutral ground, and Russians were not very happy when Chinese built their military post in Tajikistan after the Taliban came in August. But this new development between West and Russia has brought Russia and China closer, and they already have a strategic alliance in 2008. In history, sometimes times comes when leaders in different states, they have some similar chemistry. And what I see from there, that President Xi and President Putin both have similar chemistry, and they have a much deeper understanding as persons, and also both Chinese and Russians are closer. I think it's a gross mistake on the part of West and EU to go into this conflict, because at the end of the day, they are going to lose.
Dr. Deepa, my new best friend, Peter Hitchens, talking of alt-right, left-wing friendships, pointed out that minds are closing all over Europe. We will not see them open again in our lifetime, and I myself feel like that. He says he's just waiting any day to be handed a white feather by a woman in the street. The propaganda sweep has been quite awesome to observe. I've been in this movie before as a dissident in the Iraq War, but this feels much more intense because of the existence of social media and not just the old media that we had back then. As a keen observer of these things, though you were too young to experience it in the Iraq War, how does it feel?
I just wanted to go back to your first comment about Peter Hitchens. And it is interesting that people like David Davis, Peter Hitchens, who, completely, in some ways, Hitchens has openly said he doesn't like Assange. He has spoken up about it, because I think both people who are principled on the right and principled on the left can have a sensible conversation based on the issues that they're discussing, while not shutting down anyone who seems to provide an opposing view. And that's what's happened in the last few years, especially with the media landscape, not just the kind of concentrations we had when, say, Maxwell and Murdoch owned the media and agreed the scale of discussion, but the kind of media manipulation that happens when YouTube shuts down RT America, or they prevent any discussion which might be critical of COVID even. And these kinds of shutting down of discussions is what allows conspiracy theories and deep hatred to flourish. And in that sense, I think we're at a point where these deep hatreds are getting more entrenched. I can see a huge amount of Russophobia in the main media narrative.
Well, you can now call for someone to be killed by virtue of an order given by the Liberal Democrat Deputy Prime Minister of Britain, as was Sir Nick Clegg. That's a sentence I never thought I'd speak. He has given Facebook users permission to call for the deaths of people, only Russians, in this conflict.
And this is the kind of racism that is flourishing with the liberals, where they're willing to take the knee and pretend Black Lives Matter, yes, but they won't stop the bombing of Iraq or the bombing of Afghanistan or the bombing of Syria or the bombing of Lebanon. They won't stop the rape, torture, murder of people. We can still have Guantanamo Bay open 20 years after it was originally set up. And yet, all of these people are supposedly motivated by anti-racist initiatives to look after the interests of the people of Ukraine. None of them cares about the people of Ukraine. All they care about is their own pockets and how much their weapons manufacturer friends are making.
Well, that might be true at the top, but there are tens of millions, maybe scores of millions of, I call them sheeple, who follow the drums without question. Let's go to Moscow, it's only fair. Professor Alexander Lukin is the head of the Department of International Relations at the High School of Economics University in Moscow. He has a PhD in Oxford University 25 years ago. Professor.
Thank you.
Did anyone foresee this level of Russian intervention in Ukraine. It's an invasion, not an intervention. Did anyone foresee that amongst your peers in Moscow? And if so, did you foresee the strength and unity of Western response?
I should say that if there were some people, there were very few, because I myself did not expect, if you mean the military action, I thought that there will be no military action. And all people around me also thought that Russian position was strong, but it was mainly to put pressure on Ukraine, but that there will be no military action because we thought it was too risky. But our government decided to go ahead with it.
Do you think this will end soon? And even when it ends, will things calm down, or are we headed into, for the rest of our lives, a really intense Cold War?
Well, everything comes to an end at some point, but we don't know. It will depend a lot on how it is finished. Like if Russia is successful in its effort to, as it say, demilitarize Ukraine and turn it into a friendly country, it would make Russia a serious alternative center of power. And it will be one story, and probably there will be a long Cold War after that. If it's not gain what it wanted, then it's another story. Then the West will dominate, and Russia will have to change some of its policies, I think.
The pessimists fear that this actually could lead not just to a hot war between Russia and NATO, but a nuclear exchange between Russia and NATO. What do you think about that?
Of course, nobody wants it. And if we are talk on the basis of reason, it should not happen, because everyone understands that a lot of people will suffer, including some governments probably. But it can be, but nuclear conflict could be a result of escalation. For example, if the West decides finally to support Ukraine militarily, or for example, introduce a no-flight zone over the Ukraine and begin shooting down Russian planes, Russia may answer with, destroying these planes on the territory of NATO countries. Then NATO begins a military action with its conventional troops. And because Russia has few conventional troops, much fewer than NATO, then the only option for it would be use tactical nuclear weapons.
Why do you think the reaction of the West was so solid and with such a united front?
Well, it's purely psychological, because, such wars are happening all the time. In Iraq and Syria, sometimes they are started by the West, most often. But of course, the Western position is that nobody else but the West can, bomb other countries or try to change governments in other countries. Everybody else is not allowed to do that. But even with Syria, for example, when Russia helped the Syrian government, I think this is psychological. Or somebody wrote in the United States that it's in a way racist. Well, I don't think that it's racist. Well, it's not exactly racist, but it's a West-centrist position. Syria is far away. Who cares about Syria? And this is right near Europe. And these people are, they look like us, Europeans, and it's very close. And it's a direct challenge to our sphere of influence. So if it happens somewhere far away, you know, in Asia or in Africa, well, the Europeans don't care that much.
Some say that this was a trap for Russia. Russia was lured into this trap, and the adversary, the NATO countries, has never been more united. What do you say about that?
I don't think that it was a trap or kind of conspiracy, that somebody really thought that we should make Russia attack Ukraine and then to finish with Russia's influence. I think it was a different way of thinking. It's like a big bully who thinks that I can do anything I want and nobody is going to answer, you know. So that's the Western position, you know. They think that they can do anything they want and nobody else can. And this is what we call unipolar world. But they don't agree that other countries can do the same thing. And actually, I would say that the Russian government is a very good student of the West from that point of view. I mean, now the Russian army is doing exactly what the West did in other countries. You know, even like, for example, destroying the TV stations. Who did it first? Of course, Americans did it first when they bombed Yugoslavia in 1999. I actually was in Belgrade at that time for a conference, and I saw it, the results. But because they did it, of course, they did not criticize it. And now, you know, other strong countries, they were the first. I wouldn't be surprised if China, say, do the same thing in Taiwan, for example. Because if Americans can do it, if Russians can do it, why Chinese cannot do it?
Professor, I don't know if you've got blue eyes. I'm not that close to you. Kind of.
Hazel.
But like me, you are, although living in the South, a Western man. It is not much understood, I think, that the West constitutes just 10% of the population of the whole world. In fact, the West, especially if this new Eurasia of which we speak solidifies, will be the periphery. We'll be the periphery in the way we used to talk about others as the periphery. The tectonic plates are shifting, are they not?
Yes, I've given speeches for a number of years now saying this is the most exciting time to be alive. We are going through what I call the sixth great human transition. The 5 transitions before this, Egyptian to Greek, Greek to Roman, Roman to Zoroastrian, Zoroastrian to Muslim, Muslim to Christian, we're now going Christian to Chinese. The Westerners are very culturally arrogant, and we look at things and we say Western domination is the natural order of things, and since 1980 China has been rising. And I'm like, well, let's just take that graph back a little bit further than 1980 to say the birth of Jesus Christ. And from the birth of Jesus Christ today, Western culture is dominated for about 15% of the time. And we are returning back to an Asian dominance, which is the norm. European dominance isn't the norm. European dominance is the spike.
It has been about 300 years though, hasn't it?
Yeah, but which is 300 years out of 2000, about 15%.
Yeah.
Now, each of the other great 5 human transitions has been followed with a really big war. Our challenge that we have right now is, are we going to go through the 6th human transition and have a really big war, or are we going to be smart enough to find a way of avoiding it? Current events tell me we're not. But I'd like to make this comment too, because I wouldn't want your viewers to think the West is wrong and Russia is right. I would say this: leadership is not a choice between a good option and a bad option. That's easy. Take the good option. Leadership is about having the ethical and moral framework to determine the least bad of bad options that are available. Likewise, yes, the West made a lot of mistakes by pushing Russia, by pushing too far east. But none of that justifies Russia invading Ukraine in the way they are today. There is neither side in this debate where you can sit back and say they're right and they're wrong. I can sit back and say parts of what they're doing are right, parts of what they're doing are right, and parts of what they're doing are wrong.
I appreciate your...
Sorry, can I interrupt?
Yeah,
because what it's going to trigger now is this question: are we going to have a massive war with this 6th
Of course, these previous transitions, and I'm going to write down what you said, it was very well expressed. A major war then was not the same as a major war now.
A major war now is potentially human destroying. And whether it is nuclear war or climate change, the catchphrase I use is human beings are the first species on the earth smart enough to wipe themselves out, but are we smart enough not to?
Yes, but don't you accept the point that the professor in Moscow was making, that you have no moral high ground from which to
Exactly.
preach, because you did all of these things, and only in the last 20 years.
George, this is the point I'm making about there not being a good side and a bad side. Everyone is covering themselves with tars and feathers. You know, when you look at, for example, China in Africa, Western commentators like to say, well, China is raping and pillaging Africa just like we raped and pillaged Africa. And when you speak to many African governments, they say, well, name me the one Chinese colonial government. No matter how bad you think China is in Africa, they're nowhere near as bad as you were. Or as an Indian colleague told me once, let me describe British colonialism in India. Take one of the richest countries in the world and make it one of the poorest countries in the world in only 200 years. Well done, Britain. You know, you said you like Britain. There's not much in British history that is actually there to be proud of, other than raping, pillaging and destroying cultures. From my country, the most effective genocide we've seen on the world, when every full-blood Tasmanian Aboriginal was wiped out by direct British government policy, by absolutely wiping every single one of them out intentionally with soldiers. So you're right, no one here covers themselves in glory. And what we've got to do is sit back and say, as a species, are we going to save ourselves from catastrophe? Either from a nuclear confrontation, the failure to deal with a pandemic, or the failure to deal with climate change. There is nothing that tells me this transition is going to end well, even though I wish to Lord that it did.
Well, pray for that. I told you they were distinguished experts, and I merely the enthusiastic amateur. So let me save the last word for myself. To answer my own question, I don't think we are going to have a nuclear war, at least not yet. I personally believe that the West has struggled mightily to lift a huge stone only to drop it on its own feet. I personally believe that the conflict in Ukraine will end with Ukrainian neutrality. I pray to God that that is by negotiation. I believe that this conflict will end with the Donbass and Crimea outside of Ukraine's sovereignty. It didn't have to be this way. It is a great tragedy that it has been this way. But I don't think that we are headed for a nuclear war. But if I'm right, and the tectonic plates shifting means an ever stronger and wealthier and happier Eurasia and an increasingly embittered West, peripheral 10% of the human population, we might just get a nuclear war somewhere down the road. I'm hoping after I've shuffled off this mortal coil, though I don't wish it on any of the future generations. This has been a special edition of كلمة as part of Mayadeen's wonderful and in-depth coverage and debate around the war in Ukraine. I hope that you have enjoyed watching. I've been George Galloway, and you have been a marvellous audience.